All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, the Twitterverse was fully alive this weekend. Controversy was swirling around President Donald Trump's endorsement of the former football coach Tommy Tuberville in the GOP Senate primary race in Alabama. Now, Tuberville is running against former Attorney General and former United States Senator Jeff Sessions for his old spot in a bitterly contested feud that, because of coronavirus, will extend all the way until July 14th. The race, in a microcosm, represents a fight over the future of the GOP and even Trump's own legacy, with Trump weighing in strongly against Sessions for recusing himself in the Mueller investigation and saying that Sessions was, quote, never mentally qualified for the job. Now, Sessions fired back that it was his duty, and Coulter called Trump disloyal, and the MAGA Twitterverse found itself fully split on the matter. Is Trumpism and Make America Great Again uniquely tailored to Trump the man? Or is it instead a broader departure from the far reach of globalism, economic orthodoxy within the GOP, and the full embrace of mass immigration as an inherent good? I obviously find myself in the latter category. And did Sessions do a great job as Attorney General? No, not really, not especially. But compared to his opponent, it becomes pretty clear who anyone wants to see an America First agenda advanced should actively support. Sessions is literally the first and lone senator to fully embrace Donald Trump's campaign. He endorsed him in February 2016, giving him the legitimacy he needed to eventually become the GOP nominee. But beyond pure political loyalty, Sessions' office was an incubator for talent across Washington, D.C., who dared to challenge the growing consensus in the Republican Party that embraced mass immigration and globalism. America First was an idea that Jeff Sessions was fighting for long before many swamp creatures in Washington started using it as a slogan. And what makes Trump's vendetta against Sessions so striking is that Sessions' opponent is exactly the type of GOP creature that Trump ran against in 2016, and his endorsement of him is purely based on personal spite and not on a policy implication. At the beginning of the pandemic, Tuberville was asked, quote, "What do you see happening with China?" An easy softball question any GOP Senate candidate could answer in some form about how they must be held accountable for covering up the virus in the early days of the pandemic. He was even asked a follow-up question to clarify, and he said that the problem with China would, quote, take care of itself, implying, of course, that the government action to repatriate U.S. supply chains is not necessary. This is obvious corporatism at the behest of big money donors. And worse, of the signature issue of Trump on immigration, Tuberville clearly believes the old school party line. In an August speech, he said, quote, "There are people coming across the border that need jobs. We want them to come over here. Let them come in and become citizens, like we all became citizens." Once again, this is the attitude that has informed the GOP immigration message for years, one in which cheap labor is imported to the United States so big business can exploit them, not pay actual American citizens a fair wage. Nobody wins in this scenario except for large agricultural conglomerates. Now, Tuberville has accused his opponents of twisting his words, but it seems obvious who he's on board with, given the fact that he hired a former Republican operative for an open borders organization. Now, the enthusiastic support of Tuberville by much of the professional GOP, and even Trump himself, represent a bigger fight for the future of the Republican Party in a post-Trump age. Regardless of what happens in 2020, folks like Tuberville and others will claim the Trump mantle and name to support tax cuts first and alone message for the GOP. They'll claim that they drained the swamp despite enriching it beyond many of its wildest dreams, and they're obfuscating their own reluctance to fulfill the promises that they made to American working men and women on the 2016 campaign trail. It is only by selecting, elevating, and boosting candidates like Sessions can the GOP develop the intellectual heft and institutional pushback against donor-centric orthodoxy, which led it to electoral defeat in the popular vote of 6 out of the 7 last presidential elections. And the reason I wanted to cover this one, Crystal, is because it's such a clear view of what the fight will be about. Is it about Trump the man and himself? Because Trump obviously is only mad at Sessions. And look, fine, yeah, you know, like whether he should have recused himself and how he handled all that. And
it worked out fine for Trump ultimately.
It did ultimately work out. But like at the end of it, look, yes, I think there is actually quite a lot of problems with that handle. But like I said, in terms of the issues, Tuberville and Sessions could not be more different, especially on the two major issues that were the reason that Trump was elected in the first place. And Sessions himself was the only senator in the Republican Party for years who was willing to push back on trade and on immigration. So it seems like it should be look, it's not one of these things where you have to go all out for the guy, but going and actively trying to campaign against Jeff Sessions, and the fact that so many people in the professional GOP are totally on board with this guy's campaign, I think it does show you a very interesting story about how if you supported Trump because of the issues, it's very clear who you should support.
Yeah.
And if there's like you support Trump the man, or you're trying to use Trumpism to grift a bunch of corporatism underneath that, then I think you know exactly who you should support.
Yeah, and look,
too.
Obviously, I don't agree with you on immigration. I think Jeff Sessions was like an original nativist who wants to blame all our problems on too many brown people. Let's put that to the side. Because what you said about personal spite over policy is how you put it. And I think that's well said. And this just absolutely demonstrates that I'm not saying Trump doesn't have any ideology. I think he does. He has been fairly consistent on these two issues in particular, specifically with regards to China and trade, and some I would characterize it as like racial fear-mongering, et cetera. He's been doing that for a long time too. But any policy preferences that he has, he always gets rolled on them ultimately by whoever's best at flattering his ego. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And so you see, this is like a very clear-cut case. If you thought that you were voting for an agenda of specific policy ideas and a particular approach to world affairs and to domestic affairs, ultimately that will always rank lower than whatever is best for Trump's ego and his like personal spite, etc. So look, I mean, we've seen the way that all the people who were completely opposed to Trump's agenda, the Ted Cruzes of the world, have a very different view in terms of economics, very much more of the libertarian branch of the party. Look, at the moment that they turn around and start sucking up to him in the right way, then they're best friends again. I mean, that's the way this whole administration's worked. And so this is a little window into why, after running on this like right populist nationalist platform, why the biggest accomplishment, if you can call it that, of his administration is this gigantic corporate tax debt. That's what happened.
That's what really bothers me about the whole thing, because Sessions created so much of this. I mean, so much of the intellectual talent, the policy knowledge, etc., all comes from Jeff Sessions. And like, he was the first one. I mean, he recognized the power of the Trump campaign. February 2016 shocked the political world, I think, second to Chris Christie, in terms of the actual establishment sitting United States senator endorsing Donald Trump. Everyone was like, whoa, what? I mean, and became a signature force behind that campaign, staffing it up, the campaign, and so much of that. And yet, because of just the Mueller stuff, and like I said, I do think it's a legitimate beef. I don't think he did a great job as Attorney General for many of the things and the way that he handled all of that investigation. But that doesn't belie the fact that on the issues themselves, that if you supported Trump, or you support Trumpism, or whatever that is, whatever that departure is, that Sessions is the clear choice over this other candidate. And so this is where you can actually see that, once again, the professional GOP has ready to kick in for these guys. They have all these operatives and all these people with baked in ideology, etc., in order to back people like Tuberville. And if the party becomes that, as I said, there's a reason that you're going to lose 6 out of the 7 electoral vote, the popular vote in the last presidential elections. And it's because there's not an agenda that actually appeals to all of people. Now, yeah, look, the electoral strategy, it can work, as it did with Trump, but that's not a sure thing. What did that come down to? 120,000 votes across 3 states? That's a much thinner margin than I'm comfortable with. And so if you truly embrace right-wing populism, in my view, you're sitting on a 56% of the vote in this country. You could easily win the popular vote and smash the Electoral College. And it's only people like Sessions who have been fighting for this for years that need to be elevated in the party, but there's no money behind that. And there's also the confusion of Trump himself on this very specific issue.
Yeah.
And that is what I'm really animated about.
Anytime you have any ideology that goes against the grain in this town, you have to be more ideological than your adversaries. You have to be more clear-eyed, more forceful, more absolutely committed to that agenda and that ideology, because you're up against all those entrenched forces of money and think tanks and all of that organization. I mean, look, we saw it spring into action here in the beginning of the coronavirus relief efforts, right? Who was ready to go? Who had all the money? Who had the legislation literally written out, ready to go to stick in the first coronavirus? So that's what you're up against, putting these specific issues aside. Anytime you break from sort of that normal operating procedure in this town. And I think what we've seen with Trump is, while he does have like these certain proclivities in terms of an agenda, he's much more focused on whoever is best at flattering him and sort of cajoling him and pledging their fealty at that moment. Jeff Sessions didn't do that very well, and so that's it for him, even though he supports the agenda.
He just doesn't understand so much, but even now, after 3.5 years of being president, about how policy is actually made in that White House, and really in Washington at large, which is that if you take a bird's eye view of it and you say you guys pass it, you're not intimately involved in the policy drafting process and making sure that the people who are drafting the policy are totally committed and on board with your agenda, you're going to get rolled. Because the way that these legislation gets written, this happened to Obama, right? It was the same thing. It's happened to the last 2 presidents who ran against the grain and ended up staffing very much with the grain.
I would say Obama was much more of a centrist from the start, that actually was a reflection of his ideology versus what people wanted to see in him and the ideology of some of the people that elected him. Frankly, with Trump, I don't think he cares about enacting an agenda. I think he cares about winning the day's news cycle. I think he cares about winning the next election. But in terms of like prioritizing an actual agenda, I don't think that's a priority for him. I just don't think he really cares.
Well, if it's not, then as I've said, the best way to win is to show somebody that by enacting this type of agenda is the only way you can win. Because these Paul Ryan types, what have they got you, right? Now you're losing on the economy. Now you're losing on the handling of the coronavirus crisis.
Paul Ryan basically lost him the midterm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No question. I mean, on the Obamacare screw up and the tax cut alone, there's a reason that happened, but they can never get it through their head. They're like, if we just cut taxes one more time, people will love us.
Look, if he led this administration with a massive infrastructure program touching every district of this country, he could have had 65, 70% approval rating.
No,
it was all there for him. And Democrats would have worked with him on that, because who can say no to project on the district? They went in a very different direction.
No. There we go.
Next on Rising, The Intercept's DC Bureau Chief Ryan Grimm discusses the influence of heterodox podcasts like Joe Rogan's on the future of media when Rising returns.